So far, we have seen that monopolies often generate allocations that are not particularly desirable, either because they are inefficient or because they entail a large transfer of surplus to the producers from the consumers. That obviously raises the question of whether there are things that the government can do to improve the outcomes in monopolistic markets. And we're going to discuss some of the instruments at its disposal. The first instrument that is widely discussed is to promote competition. And the problem with this instrument is that it has limitations. Okay, it works sometimes, but not others. So where does it work? So a typical example will be eliminate patronage or eliminate government-created monopolies, especially when they don't have monopolies, when they don't have a particularly economic justification for existing. Now, another example here that sometimes could be useful is R&D, research and development in new technologies that can increase competition. So let me give you a favorite example of mine. Right now, a typical example of a monopoly are utilities. For example, the companies that bring broadband to you or the companies that bring power to your house. Now, imagine the development of very small cost-efficient reactors that could serve a city block or a small city. That will introduce, the development of such reactors will introduce enormous competition in the electricity utility market and will naturally break the monopolistic nature of this market. And there are many other examples out there that one can think of. Now, but there are also cases in which it doesn't hold. For example, if there are true market economies or network economies, it's hard to promote competition because the monopolistic nature of the market is inherent to the characteristics of the market. Another very common policy to try to address monopolistic competition and the problems that they generate is regulation. And this is, for example, extremely common in the utility market. And the idea is the following. Suppose that the government has full information, okay, about the market. So in particular, it knows the cost function of the monopolies and the demand function. Then it can compute the optimal price and the optimal quantity. And don't be confused, the optimal quantity is obvious. By what I mean by the optimal price is what's the marginal benefit of the last unit or the optimal unit. Okay, then the government can get the Pareto optimal allocation using either what is called quantity regulation or price regulation. And let me describe each one of them. In price regulation, what the government says is that the price has to be this optimal price, and again, this is equal to the aggregate marginal benefit of the optimal unit. And then monopolies is free to sell at this price. It chooses how much to sell at this price. And in quantity regulation, what the government says is that the monopolist has to sell Q equals to Q optimal and is free to charge any price. Any, let's be specific, single price. There's no price discrimination. Now, it's very easy to see that in both cases, the government replicates the equilibrium of the market economy. Let's look at the case of the quantity regulation. For example, suppose that the government tells the monopolist that this has to be the outcome, this has to be what it has to produce. What is the monopolist going to do? It faces this inverse demand function, well, it's going to want to charge exactly this price. This is the price at which it maximizes its profits, and that price is going to be the price of the monopolist with regulation. And it's going to be equal to this optimal price. Now, in contrast, consider what happens with price regulation. The government tells the monopolist it can sell whatever it wants at this price. And then the monopoly chooses quantity, but what does the monopoly have? It has its marginal cost function, and what is it going to choose? is going to choose this quantity with a regulation that is equal to the optimal quantity by design. Why do we know that it's there? Because we know that at the optimal quantity, marginal benefit has to be equal to marginal cost. Let me make two remarks about this policy that are important. The first one, it replicates the outcome of the competitive market equilibrium. So if the firm had, to be precise, it replicates the outcome that would have happened if the monopolist had acted exactly as a competitive firm. And it doesn't involve any taxes or transfer or anything like that, so it's relatively simple. But the second, it depends, or it requires full information to be able to compute P optimal and Q optimal. And this is very important, okay? One of the great advantages of the market that we saw before, it was able to generate these Pareto optimal allocations without anybody having to know this information. If we have a monopolist, the government can fix it, but it needs that information. And that information is not always available. That's what was one of the reasons we use markets in the first place. So in order to really study the effects of regulation in a realistic setting, one needs to model the uncertainty that the government has when it's choosing these policies and the amount of information that it really has, and things look significantly more complicated. That's well beyond the scope of this course, but if you're interested, I urge you to take more economics, in particularly either industrial organization or an area known as public economics. The government can also use tax policy to try to incentivize the monopolies to produce the optimal amount, and in particular, it can use a subsidy, sigma, of size A aggregate marginal benefit at the optimal amount minus the marginal revenue of the monopolist at the optimal amount, or the optimal quantity. If it gives it this subsidy, then you get the first best level, or the Pareto optimal level of production, I'm sorry. And this is the way to see that. Look at this diagram of the problem of the monopolist. You have the inverse aggregate demand function, you have the marginal revenue function, and you have the marginal cost of the monopolist, say something like this. The government would like the monopolist to produce at this level, which is the optimal amount, but it notes that the monopolist is always going to set its net marginal cost equals to marginal revenue. Now notice the following. Under a subsidy, the problem of the monopolist becomes to maximize over Q greater or equal than 0 its revenue. This is revenue, total revenue, and we can write this as minus C of Q minus sigma Q. We can write the costs like this. I understand that we could have put the subsidies here, but I want to write them like here. I want to put them in the cost to pass you some intuition. From this perspective, the problem of the monopolist becomes to set, just as before, marginal revenue from here equals to marginal cost in quotation marks. Now, what does that do to this, our graph of the problem we have been looking, is as if the marginal cost curve has shifted down by sigma. And then, if it has shifted down by exactly that amount, the monopolist is going to want to set its quantity of the monopolist given the subsidy equals to the optimal quantity. Notice that the market equilibrium price in that case is this. Which is going to be equal to basically the aggregate marginal benefit at the optimal quantity. Okay? Now, some important remarks. First, Pareto optimality is possible only if the cost of the subsidy can be paid with lump sum taxes. Okay, there's going to be a transfer of money to the producer, that transfer needs to be financed with some revenue. That revenue is to raise with taxes. If those taxes are lump sum, then they don't introduce an inefficiency. But if they have to be raised with some sort of distortionary tax, then full restoration of Pareto optimal is not possible, and the efficiency cost of raising the money has to be deducted. The second point that is important is that in general, or typically, this policy has bad distributional properties. And the intuition is very simple. What the policy does is it taxes the consumers and it gives the cash as an incentive to the producer. But in equilibrium, the producers end up getting a transfer, the monopolies in particular, equal to that amount. Now, if the ownership of the monopolies is concentrated in a small fraction of consumers or even in someone beyond the market, that entails a huge redistribution from consumers to producers. And I'm going to ask you to explore this in more detail in the next practice problem. And finally, I want to highlight again, for very similar reasons to before, that Pareto optimality requires full information by the government. And in particular, enough information to be able to compute what the optimal subsidy is, what is the marginal benefit for society at the optimum, and what is the marginal revenue for the producer. That requires a lot of information that the government often doesn't have.